For as long as I can recall, I have held the belief that a soul or some equivalent resides in all living things. The ways in which I think that connects to the world around me has morphed and grown more complex as I've grown older, but that idea has never faded from my mind. The odd thing about this belief is that I have no proof whatsoever, yet I will fervently claim that it must be true. I could never bring myself to accept that the beauty that exists in all things will simply vanish from existence one day. Surely it will be put to good use by the universe in the end, one way or another. If only you had a few hours to spare and I a few beers to share, I'd love nothing more than to sit in the gentle glow of a campfire, meandering down every rabbit hole that we might come across. But unfortunately you don't and I don't, so until that day comes, this video will have to do. For now. Metaphys is a shortened form of the word metaphysics or metaphysical. While it appears to be a one-to-one translation from the Japanese to English names, other translations give us some additional clarity. For instance, the German Metaphysischer Vollstrecker actually translates to metaphysical executor. But what is metaphysics and how does it connect to these cards? Now I won't lie, I am wholly unqualified to attempt to explain any of this to anyone. So here goes. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that seeks to explain the inherent truths of reality that we are unable to perceive in our daily lives. The allegory of Plato's cave works well as an illustration of this concept. In this work, Plato describes the following scenario. Within a cave exists a collection of prisoners. These prisoners are chained to a boulder with their backs to a torch burning behind them, and have been so for their entire lives. They are sat facing a cave wall and are unable to turn to look at the world behind them. While sat there, people will walk between the torchlight and the backs of the prisoners, projecting a shadow on the wall before them. To the prisoners, these shadows are the only other entities they have ever known. These shadows will be given names and become familiar to the observers. They are reality, but as we know, are not an actual representation of the world around them if they could just turn around and see. However, they don't want to leave this reality. This is all they have known, and are content with that. Metaphysics would use this concept as a way to explain that the things we all perceive in the world as being nothing more than shadows cast on our own cave walls. So what then is the truth of our existence? If we shift our attention to the Metaphys cards, we can see that the artworks depict a similar idea. All of the monsters, with the exception of Executor, are just higher dimensional retrains of existing monsters. They are all very recognizable as their counterparts, only now more ghostly and faint. We can see right through them to the world in the background beyond them. They are merely shadows of the monsters we are familiar with. This is further explored in the main mechanic they focus on being the banished zone. If we were to make a meta-analysis on this within the context of the game, this is a zone that was initially unnamed and unused. The first card to even mention the concept, Soul Release, originally stated that the cards were, quote, removed from the current duel, before becoming removed from play, and then banished. Even in a set as recent as Phantom Nightmare, the name of the zone that the banished cards end up in has been renamed to Banishment. The game itself has had to go through the process of trying to learn the details of what its own mechanics actually are. The truth of the banished zone was not known and now is, and because of that we now have countless cards that can perceive this zone. If we go a step beyond that and dig into the anime, the perception of the monsters changed drastically over the course of the series. In the first episode, we see the monsters as only artwork on a card being played on a table. They then quickly become holograms produced by Kaiba technology. We travel back in time and see them as magical beasts summoned through stone tablets, and eventually they just become flat-out monsters terrorizing Domino City.
Monsters! Real monsters!
While a lot of this is likely unintentional, it does give us a small hint in exactly what the Metaphys monsters are meant to be. If we look at the counterpart monsters, they are all based on dragons, with the exception of Daedalus, who is a Leviathan, and Executor, who we will circle back to in a moment. These are all mythological creatures, as far as we know. This brings me to my theory. While a tesseract is not strictly metaphysical, I feel it does have some crossover. Put simply, a tesseract, or hypercube, is a four-dimensional cube. Starting from the bottom, imagine that a line extends infinitely in both directions. This is the first dimension, which consists of width, or the distance between 2 points. If we were to take 4 of these lines and arrange them in a square, you're now looking at the second dimension, width and height. If we were to repeat the same process to create 5 more squares all locked together, we have a cube, the third dimension, width, height, and depth. This is where we as humans currently reside, and is the extent of our ability to perceive. But what if we took 6 cubes and locked them together? Now we have a hypercube. With this shape, something exists outside of the lowly three-dimensional cube at the center, and this is where the fourth dimension exists. This fourth dimension is composed entirely of phenomena that we aren't equipped to observe. Unfortunately, the theoretical and abstract nature of this concept means that we really have no way of knowing what could exist in this space. But luckily for you, and science as a whole, I have the answer. The Metaphys. My theory is that these fantastical creatures exist in this fourth dimension, hidden in plain sight. If these monsters are able to manifest enough power, they can force themselves near the plane that we can see. So within the hypercube model, that would sit them right about here. When this happens, the image of the monster begins to bleed into our reality, even if just for a moment, and reveal themselves to us. That's why in the artwork for all of the Metaphys monsters, they appear as ghostly apparitions, surrounded in a clouded ethereal backdrop, just before returning to the space from whence they came. This concept seems to be supported in the art of both Metaphys Factor and Asa Metaphys. In the former, Ragnarok seems to be communicating to Armed Dragon through an opening created by the barrier between the two having shattered. In the latter, Tyrant Dragon is shown forcing its way through the barrier into our dimension in what appears to be a painful act, as it's seen roaring in anguish. And although it may seem like I'm pulling these connections out of the same realm from which the Metaphys originate, Kazuki Takahashi has played with these ideas before. The entire plot of the Dark Side Dimensions revolves around Kaiba's quest to finally defeat Atem, even going so far as, and quick spoiler warning here if you haven't watched it yet, jumping into a Kaiba Corp machine capable of transporting him to whatever dimension Atem currently resides in through the power of Aigami's magical Rubik's Cube. Some of us may think we're dedicated to our craft, but we've got nothing on our boy here. An accompanying art book came alongside the release of the movie in 2016. The Millennium Book is a collection of bios and illustrations by Takahashi. The cover of the book sees Kaiba and Yugi standing side by side, framing the title down the center, while Atem lurks in the background, appearing eerily similar to the color palette of the Metaphys monsters. The coolest part of this cover is that the ghostly image of Atem isn't just printed on the cover. It's actually printed on the paper cover of the book with a semi-translucent dust jacket with the rest of the image sitting over the top of it. This was an allusion made by Takahashi to the dimensional travel scene in the film. Maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think this was an idea that came much later in the game's development. I present to you this additional character guidebook, this time only featuring Yugi with an image of Atem projected in the background using the same translucent dust jacket trick. This one, however, was released in 2002. There is one Metaphys entity that we haven't talked about yet, Executor, the only Metaphys monster without a counterpart. Upon initial release, I interpreted the name as referring to an executioner, just shortened in a similar way that Metaphys is a shortened word. That was mostly because of his strange long arm that I assumed was some sort of weapon, like he's some kind of Dark Souls boss, I guess. What it actually refers to is a being that puts events into action. This is a manifestation of God, though not in a religious sense, but rather the concept of a force that exists infinitely, with the purpose of setting in motion all events throughout time. The abstract nature of Executor is further expanded upon by its appearance. Although somewhat humanoid, the strange arm in the forefront of the image seems to act as a conduit for Creatio Ex Nihilo. In Metaphys Ascension, we see a bright light emanating from Executor's outstretched arm, as if having just birthed a new universe. Where its legs should be, it instead has long tendrils that are connected to what appear to be separate universes or dimensions. This feels reminiscent of one of H.P. Lovecraft's eldritch horrors. I felt this even more when assessing Metaphys Dimension. Here we see the face at the end of the magical arm fixated on one of these dimensions. At first I assumed it was menacing, but the similarities between this and the way in which the outer god, Yog-Sothoth, appear and operate leads me to believe it is actually a being made up of all existence, and is simply admiring the beauty of what it has created. Likewise, Yog-Sothoth is described as all-knowing and all-seeing, existing everywhere throughout every time-space continuum, thus connecting these universes through its own existence. Both Yog-Sothoth and Executor are the material by which all reality is comprised. But don't let any of this weigh on you too heavily. It's just a theory after all.
A game theory.
And if you're out and about one day and catch a glimpse of one of these beasts breaking through the ether, don't be scared. You've just ascended above the rest of us in your ability to perceive the universe. And Tyrant Dragon just wants to say hello. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.